Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Alexandra Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The Bulletin was founded 80 years ago by the scientists who created the ultimate disruptive technology, nuclear weapons. Over the years, we've expanded our coverage to include other man-made existential risks, including climate change, disruptive technologies, and biological threats. The accumulation and interaction of all these threats are why the Doomsday Clock is now set at 89 seconds to midnight. The July edition of our magazine, entitled Flashpoints, Where Might Doomsday Begin?, is focused on how any or all of these threats might trigger the next global conflict or disaster. Our magazine is supported by our subscribers and donors, so if that's you, thank you. You're the reason we can keep doing this important work. If you're not a subscriber yet, we'll put the link in the chat. In this month's issue, we assembled a truly stellar and diverse group of experts, including Fiona Hill discussing Putin, Trump, and Ukraine, Orville Schell on China and Taiwan, Rachel Min-Young Lee covering North Korea, and today's guest, David Sanger, whose interview covered the cyberstorm on the horizon. David Sanger, for those of you who don't know, is the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. He's been with the paper for more than 40 years and has been a part of multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning teams. David has authored many books, two of which, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, and New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West, would be great follow-up reads after this conversation, perhaps even a beach read. I've actually been on panels where David was the moderator and directed tough questions at me. So today it'll be my turn to ask him some tough questions about how cyber tools and technologies are changing the nature of warfare. At about 1:40, I'll turn to all of you for questions. To ask one, simply type in the chat function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. First, David, thank you so much for joining us today. And to set the landscape, can you give us a brief overview of the threats posed by cyber weapons and how they've been used by non-state actors and individuals thus far?
Well, Alex, thanks for having me. I've been a reader of the Bulletin for not all of those 80 years, but more of them than I'd want to admit. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that there's like a good revenge factor here for the fact that I was moderator for panels that you were on. I should have been more alert to that when I agreed to all this. So it's really great to be back with you. So one of the things that we have discovered about cyber weapons is that they, while everybody's early temptation when it first became clear that there were cyber threats was to compare it to nuclear, we discovered that, in fact, the analogy was a pretty poor one. The one thing that was clear that sort of did come together was that both of these could have enormous disruptive effects. But after that, almost everything was different. For example, a nuclear weapon's pretty much on an on-off switch. You can adjust the yield, but if you detonate a nuclear weapon, you have crossed a real Rubicon, and that's why, fortunately, we're about to pass the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We just last week had the anniversary of the Trinity test, and we have not seen a nuclear weapon used in anger since. Cyber, on the other hand, is on a thermostat. You can dial it up and you can dial it down. We see it used every single day. And in The Perfect Weapon, which came out in 2018, and for those of you who would rather spend your summer watching documentaries than reading books on the beach, the HBO doc came out in 2020. In The Perfect Weapon, I argued that what made cyber a perfect weapon was its use in short of war cases, right? Because the reason the US attacked the Natanz nuclear enrichment site using the Stuxnet weapon in an operation called Olympic Games with the Israelis, obviously predated by 15 years, the bombing last month of Natanz and of Fordo. was to have a way to try to destroy those centrifuges without the risk of a big kind of kinetic attack of the kind that we saw last week. Um, the reason that China uses cyber weapons against the United States, whether it's getting into the utility grid or into the telecom network, is to have a way to attack the US, sometimes to conduct surveillance, sometimes to destroy data, but to do it without risking that you would get into an open conflict with China. Same thing for Russia. And the only people who really have nuclear weapons right now that we know of are the 9 nuclear states, whereas everyone's got cyber weapons, right? It's in the hands of criminals, it's in the hands of ransomware groups, it's in the hands of teenagers. And this is what makes the deterrence issue so difficult, because it's one thing to deter a nation state, it's another thing to deter a ransomware group, a criminal group. And those of us who have had teenagers in the house know deterrence with teenagers simply does not work. so so it's a very different kind of problem. I think what we've seen more recently, though, is that while cyber is a short of war weapon, once a war starts, it can be used as a supplementary weapon. And we've seen it used widely by both sides in the Ukraine war. I'm sure we'll get to that later on. We've seen the Israelis use it just a few weeks ago against a bank in Iran as part of their overall campaign against Iran. We have seen the Russians make use of it uh, in short of war ways against the United States, but also as part of kinetic activity. And in the future of warfare, we suspect that we're going to see it integrated more. And the comparison I frequently use, Alex, is this, that rather than compare it to the bomb, compare it to the invention of the airplane. I have a book downstairs that was published in 1910 in Britain called Aeroplanes in Peace and War. AERO planes. You got to love how this was done. And uh, it asked questions like, could London be bombed? Well, by the time the second edition came out, we had the answer to that question. But it envisioned aeroplanes as being used as air war as separate from regular war, right? Kinetic war. And in World War I, there was supplementary use. There was a little bit of air war underway, but it wasn't decisive. The war would have ended the same way and at about the same time without airplanes. By World War II, it had integrated into the rest of our forces, ultimately was used to drop the atomic bomb, and was a very different factor. And I would argue that in the cyber world, we are somewhere after World War I. We've had a couple of creative skirmishes, but before the big use of World War II.
Yeah, so sort of these new cyber tools of warfare are an enabler rather than sort of an element
They
unto itself.
they're an
You
additional
talked,
weapon. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you talked in your interview about two specific instances that we're now generally thinking were tied to the Chinese government: Bolt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. So for people unfamiliar, can you kind of go through those attacks? With everything in the news, I think these may have slipped by a lot of people.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. And it's funny because I've run into US government officials who have said to me, "Oh, thank goodness we finally got the FBI director." This was back when Chris Wray was still director, to testify in public about Salt Typhoon. So now the whole world knows that it exists. And I think you could stop 100 people on Connecticut Avenue in D.C.
Mhm.
and most of them would think you're either talking about a really cool recipe or a sci-fi movie. Um, Volt Typhoon was discovered first. And that's the implant of code in the utilities grid. Nothing new there. The Russians did it years ago. The Times reported during the first Trump administration, with a colleague of mine at that time, Nicole Perlroth, we reported that the US retaliated by putting code in the Russian system that they intended for the Russians to see, precisely to create a deterrent effect. The way the Russians do it, they put the code there, you go search around, you try to rouse the code out, erase it, and of course they come back in. There's sort of a cat and mouse game underway. The Chinese are a lot more subtle about it. They will create an access, put in a tool, test what it could go do, withdraw the tool. So all you see is the empty hole of where something had come in, but you never know when you've fully gotten it out. So Volt Typhoon was basically a disruptive code in the grid that could be used to shut the grid down. And that was worrisome enough because when it was discovered, it was overwhelmingly in areas around bases in the United States, Guam, Hawaii, that would be used in a response to an incident in Taiwan. And so you can imagine if they have the possibility to turn off the electricity or the gas or water supplies to bases, most of which use outside supplies coming in inside the fence of the base, they could drastically slow or maybe stop altogether the response to a Taiwan incident. And of course, in all the Taiwan scenarios, time is of the essence. And if they can take the island before the United States can put in significant force, then it's game over. Salt Typhoon really got discovered by private sector folks at Microsoft last summer. And that was a very carefully designed series of Chinese intrusions that went after our commercial telecom companies, and particularly after the legacy companies that had bought up other firms and other networks. So as they integrate those networks, it creates a seam, right, between the old networks and the new. And that almost always creates a vulnerability that somebody can exploit. And they exploited it to the point that they got into the database the Justice Department uses for setting up wiretaps, legal court-approved wiretaps. So the Chinese could figure out who among their agents had been blown already, right? Or who was operating without any surveillance. They got into unencrypted phone conversations and had access to, we don't know if they actually listened to, conversations that President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, both then still candidates, were involved in. So it was a really remarkable intrusion. And when you pour truth serum into the drinks of intelligence and administration officials, they will tell you it's not over. They have never really succeeded in cleaning the system out.
So based on those two attacks, should people be worried that cyber targeting will happen to both civilian and military infrastructure in the future? And how safe are our communication systems, especially, as you said, at those top levels of government, beyond user error of, unsecured apps? Are our phones secure? Are our leaders' phones secure?
No, no, and no. Think back to Signalgate. Okay, now we all remember it because Jeff Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, was, incorrectly added on to this conversation, and we read what the conversation was. But ask yourself the question, why were they in Signal chats to begin with? And you've heard the former national security advisor make the argument that they were told to use Signal for unclassified conversations starting at the end of the Biden administration during the transition. Why were they told to use Signal? Because everybody knew the Chinese were deep inside the unencrypted phone system. And Signal at least gives you fully encrypted, end-to-end encrypted stuff that we believe the US government has had a hard time cracking. You'll notice that very few government officials use WhatsApp. I'll have to leave it to your imagination why they would conclude that that was too risky. But you didn't have this conversation that was underway about the coming strike in Yemen on Signal for no reason at all. You had it on because of Salt Typhoon.
Yeah. Though, of course, they could have been using secure comms lines, and I think increasingly
Yes,
as we
right.
think about the weaponization of disinformation and these potential cyber attacks, I think there's probably a deeper discussion to be had about secure comms within a country, but also between countries. But that will save that for later. It's a sort of an arms control
Also,
concept.
you'll find that journalists use Signal a lot, and that's because they worry about the US government. And the servers are outside the United States, don't retain the conversations. So if there are efforts by the government to track down sources, you want that to be on Signal.
Mhm. So we were talking about these Chinese incursions. What have the responses and actions been on the U.S. side in terms of incorporating these types of tools and technologies into our, defense strategy? Some potential examples of what the U.S. has done in this space.
So obviously, on the defensive side, the government, U.S. government, will talk endlessly, and you hear a lot about resilience, and you hear a lot about using full encryption and so forth. And even after Signalgate, government officials were using Signal by and large. Um, the big question for the Trump administration is that early in their time, they indicated that they would be much more aggressive in the use of offensive cyber against countries that were attacking us, manipulating our data, and so forth. But we've never heard that fleshed out. And of course, early on, they fired the the General Tim Hawk, who was running the National Security Agency, and he also had the four-star command over U.S. Cyber Command, which does a lot of America's offensive work. But we never got a real description from the administration about what they meant by that. Because it's one thing to sort of stand up in front of Congress and say, we're going to get more aggressive. And the last administration was full of wimps. And if the Chinese attack us, they should be prepared to be attacked and so forth. But Bob Gates, the former US Defense Secretary and former head of the CIA, had a great phrase when he was in office. I just saw him the other day. And it was the three least heard words in Washington are, and then what? As if we step up our offensive activity, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans would sort of just step back and say, oh, wow, I'm never doing that again. Or they're like, game on, right? And as I said, this is not like nuclear weapons. You are not concerned that if you launch this, your country's going to disappear in the next 39 minutes.
So you mentioned Iran, and earlier you mentioned Stuxnet. Would that be an example of the U.S. In terms of offensive use of these capabilities?
Stuxnet was definitely an early test. It was the most sophisticated cyber weapon used by one state against another. It went bad for no one's own particular fault. It was an accident that it got out. And I often reminded people of that during the leak investigation about how we published so much about it. So we didn't make the code public. Somebody who probably had the virus, or in this case, it was a worm, on their laptop as they went in to go work on the Titan's computer systems, then likely went home, plugged in, the computer didn't realize it had changed environments, and suddenly this super secret code developed by the Israelis and the United States to slow down and ultimately destroy the centrifuges underground at Natanz, um, that code got out in public and people began to dissect it. And I wrote a story not long ago in the Times about what tipped us off to what the target was, which was when you read through the code of the worm, it would be activated when it saw groups of 164 machines at the other end. And the reason that was notable is that if you knew anything about the Iranian nuclear program, you knew that they grouped their centrifuges at that time in clusters of 164. And so when I saw that in the code, I knew right away what the target was, that it was the Natanz plant. And it's a really interesting example of why cyber is not really a silver bullet. The use of Stuxnet destabilized about 1,000 of the 5,000 centrifuges that were spinning at Natanz at that time. And it made them wobble by speeding them up or slowing them down and ultimately explode. And then that would take out the centrifuge next to that. And meanwhile, you had leaking uranium gas everywhere. So no one really wanted to go down and try to repair all of this. So it created a lot of damage. And a really interesting question, and I hope, Alex, you'll invite me back once we know the answer to this, is what did more havoc to the enrichment process, the cyber attack or last month's actual physical attacks on Natanz?
I mean, one, we'll take you up on that offer, but two, what is your take in as far as what Stuxnet did and then subsequently the diplomatic efforts of JCPOA versus, just a old school kinetic attack on the facilities?
Going it the old way and just blowing things up. So a little bit of an unfair comparison because at the time the Stuxnet attack happened, 2009, 2010, there were about 5,000 centrifuges sitting at Natanz. Fordo hadn't been built yet. It was just in the early construction phase. And we think that Stuxnet set the Iranians back a year and a half before they could rebuild. But ultimately, what did they do, Alex? They went from 5,000 centrifuges to well over 10,000. And then they built Fordo inside a mountain, sealed it off from most outside internet connections, most outside electrical connections. And in total, the Iranians had about 18,000 centrifuges spinning at the time that the war broke out. And we think most of those were destroyed during the attacks, but not before the Iranians had gotten the fuel for about 10 weapons worth out of most of the storage areas, if you believe the IAEA, that were in Isfahan. So you bought some time with cyber. You bought more time with the 2015 Obama era agreement. Maybe you bought 2 years, if we're lucky, out of last week's attacks.
But as you said earlier, and then what?
Yes.
So we'll see on that. We've talked about China, Iran, the United States. Of course, we have yet to talk about Russia and their experiences using cyber weapons, both in sort of an overt and covert way. So can you talk a little bit about that history and what we can expect in terms of how the Russians will continue to use these weapons, and will they increase the use of these weapons?
So first, there's this sort of urban myth kicking around that cyber has not been used much in the Ukraine war. It's been used a lot. Think about the week before the war started. Suddenly, the Vianet satellite network that was used by the Ukrainian military went silent. Not because the Russians did some high-tech cyber attack on the space systems, but because instead they attacked the ground modems and took them out. Readers of New Cold Wars will see a scene at the beginning where Microsoft, through its oversight capacities in a really anonymous building outside Dulles Airport here in Washington, uh, detected that the Russians were beginning to activate code against Ukrainian uh, government offices. And when the Microsoft people saw that, they warned the Ukrainians, of course, but then they sent a message up to their own leadership, and they went over to Ann Neuberger, who at the time was the NSC top official running cyber and emerging technologies. She went in to go tell Jake Sullivan. That turned out to be the indicator that the Russians were getting ready to roll in the physical attacks. We saw the attacks used time and time again during the war, sometimes old electronic warfare, sometimes more sophisticated true hacking. And of course, we even saw it being used in the war between Israel and Hamas. And when Israel got to attacking Iran, it attacked a bank that was used by a lot of middle class workers and so forth, and was woefully badly protected. And that was a way to try to bring the cost of the war home to ordinary Iranians.
What's the danger, though, of a state-based actor attacking a banking system in another country?
So the Federal Reserve, which has got bigger problems right now with President Trump, uh, does not like the idea of offensive cyber being used against the central bank, because they think that once that precedent is set, countries will attack the Fed, the US will end up attacking the banks of other nations, and you begin to lose the credibility and confidence in the international banking system.
It sounds to me like there are conversations that, probably need to be happening in the international community about norms and behaviors in terms of how we use these particular weapons. Of course, they're evolving all the time. And, AI being the bright, shiny object in international security discussions. How do you see AI affecting these tools that we've been using clearly for some time?
Well, it's a huge accelerator both on offense and on defense, and it creates the possibility of using of autonomous weapons. So when I said that, in fact, you had seen in World War II the merger of the airplane with other forms, and you couldn't imagine operating a major military operation without an air campaign now. I don't think you would imagine operating one without a major cyber campaign as well. It's just not talked about as frequently. Um, Ukraine's been a really interesting example. The drone war has used a lot of traditional interference between the drones and their commanders using old-fashioned electronic warfare, right? Try to interrupt the link, the GPS link, or any communications link between the operator and the drone. Now, for the past 6 months or so, you have seen both the Russians and the Ukrainians put fiber optic cable on the actual drones, maybe 20 kilometers of it. And they're running the whole air war using the drones with instructions back to an operator over a fiber optic line that's incredibly thin, looks more like spider web material. And now the forests and small towns in Ukraine are overrun with these little pieces of abandoned of fiber optic material that are used for connections to the drones, and it's beginning to foul the environment. But that's an example of what happens when you're trying to make sure that your link doesn't get interrupted. Um, we're seeing now that part of the response is to develop more autonomous drones that don't require communications back home at all. In other words, you build the targeting into it, it uses local recognition for the target and goes right for it. The problem is you can't call that back, and the whole concept of man on the loop is gone. And as the explosive charges you fit into them get bigger and bigger and bigger, you can imagine the trouble that that will create.
So in effect, the drive to keep these new technologies safe is pushing us further in the direction of autonomy before we've actually had a lot of the legal, political
Legal,
and diplomatic
moral,
debates.
whatever,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it's my view, and I say this in the article in the bulletin, in the interview in the bulletin. All this talk we've had in the Pentagon about man on the loop, man in the loop, so forth,
Mm.
woman in the loop along the way here. This all assumes an old world in which there is time in the decision making to have a human being overseeing a software driven, agent driven conflict. Well, the Russians and the Chinese are not spending much of their time thinking about who's in the loop. They're thinking about how can they make these operate independent of human beings in the loop. And thus that becomes part of the deterrent. You can wipe out our leadership the way the Israelis wiped out the nuclear scientists in Iran in the opening hours of the war. But you are not likely to actually stop the weapons, which can operate independently of human beings.
Hmm. Yeah, the human in the loop issue has come up in the nuclear space, and we have seen the United States, France, the UK, and now China all affirm that they would have meaningful human control over nuclear launch authority. The Russians have been reticent to sign up to that. But it sounds like you're saying there's sort of levels under which countries would be comfortable sort of leaving the decisions up to, human program machines and, you know,
Well, let's unpack this for a moment, Alex. The U.S. during the Biden administration got an agreement from the Chinese, though the Chinese didn't talk much about it, that basically said no use of nuclear weapons without humans making the decision. Okay, cool. Is that the end of the story? Hardly. If you have AI agents that are actually,
uh, oh,
do we have a brief?
yeah, I think
You
we had a pause. You were
you,
talking about
right,
the Chinese-US agreement
right.
on, yeah.
So the Chinese and the US had an agreement no decisions would be made about the use of nuclear weapons except by human beings, by leaders, which is great. But it's not the end of the story, right? So supposing the data that those human beings are making their decision on is AI generated, AI influenced, is phony, right? And the president's making a decision about whether to use the nuclear force, the use it or lose it decisions that the Bulletin has written about so well for 8 decades now,
Mm.
based on false information or a misreading by an AI agent or a set of assumptions, or worse yet, a set of hallucinations. So if the data in is bad, the human decision could be bad, right? The second is
And
you could see an accelerant here where AI is providing advice and guidance to the human being. You have 43 seconds to make this decision to launch before you lose that set of launchers. And if that's bad, if that's been affected, if it's been hacked, all of a sudden you've got the president making a good human decision based on bad info.
mhm. I just for those of our listeners who don't know what hallucinations are, if you could just briefly explain, you know, a nutshell of AI hallucinations.
So in some early testing of large language models, we have seen machine learning go off in different directions and wild hallucinations, where it wasn't clear how they got on that track. And of course, the most famous one happened with Kevin Roose, our New York Times columnist, who had a large language model that was urging him to leave his wife and run off with her. It was a hilarious column. For those of you who've not gotten back to go do it.
Mm.
And he reproduced the conversation back and forth. you'll be glad to know that Kevin and his wife are just fine, despite despite what went on. But it
Mm,
became one of the most read New York Times AI columns because
mm.
it really showed you what would happen once you wrote the code, and the program got out of control.
Yeah. So we posted a link to some of the bulletin content on this issue and the fallibility of AI.
Yeah,
I want to get to questions from the audience, but I do want to take us, we were talked about sort of ground operations, airplanes, drones, and let's move up into space. The concern that people have about cyberspace having already become a new conflict domain. Many are worried outer space is going to soon follow. Will cyber warfare necessarily affect our space assets, satellites, infrastructure, and can we expect that future wars will, as you said, have a cyber component, will also have a space component?
absolutely. And you've seen it already. So I mentioned before the attack on the European satellite system that the Russians did without ever doing anything in space, right? I mean, they attacked the modems, brought that down on the ground, and the network was out. Um,
Hmm.
the US has until now relied on networks of huge billion-dollar spy satellites, communication satellites that take years and years to build, are super expensive and highly vulnerable, right? Not only to cyber attack, but just to one of these Chinese essentially space mines that, nestle up against a large satellite and could explode and destroy it. And we've seen the Chinese do tests of that maneuver. We haven't seen them actually try to go destroy these. If you've got a system that is reliant on the cloud, you are only as good as the link that connects your users to that data in the cloud. And so
Mhm.
if you can take out an opponent's ability to communicate, that's a big deal. Um, I don't know what you think, Alex, of Elon Musk. I live in Washington, D.C. There's no one who doesn't have a strong opinion about Elon Musk, one way or the other. But the fact of the matter is that before Doge, in the early days of the war in Ukraine, Elon Musk saved the country by giving them Starlink that enabled them to move their data from Ukraine, where it was sitting in servers that were vulnerable to missile attack and ultimately were
Mhm.
destroyed, move that data to the cloud and communicate to it over an extremely diverse Starlink network that involves thousands of satellites. That's the way to go do it. And you're seeing the US government belatedly move to inexpensive networks of thousands of satellites rather than these big satellites. But the move has been wildly too slow.
Hmm.
And
The
getting the big contractors to think about giving up their contracts for multi-billion-dollar satellites to put up networks of inexpensive satellites is, like getting air forces to give up manned aircraft so that they could, send up $500 drones the way the Ukrainians do.
You're basically saying one of the ways to protect ourselves against cyber attacks is to basically diffuse information data over many systems like with Starlink.
Thousands of
Is it
satellites. Right.
is there a danger though in relying on a system that is effectively controlled by a private individual? Like
Sure.
what are the implications of that kind of reliance?
No, that's a big worry. And, when you read the biography of that appeared of Musk a few years ago, what by Walter Isaacson. There's this amazing scene in it where the Ukrainians call and they want to turn on service around Crimea, which Starlink did not have, so that they could target Russian ships for missile attack, right? Something they've
Mm,
done very successfully since. And Musk didn't want to do it because someone had told him, if you do this, it's going to start World War III. Now, I'm glad Musk was being careful about starting World War III. Nobody wants to start World War III. But suddenly you had the world's richest man playing national security advisor, right? And telling the Ukrainians, no, I'm not going to turn on that access. So now you are seeing SpaceX building a secure system for the Pentagon that Musk says he will not control. And now that he's split so publicly with President Trump and declared that he's going to start a third party and so forth, I actually believe him when he says he's not going to control the military system, because it's going to be amazing to see if they even finish the contract.
Hmm. Uh, we could, I think, dig in on the implications of that and sort of, how these public-private partnerships are going to continue to be an increasing factor in our security. But we'll switch to questions from the
Alex,
audience.
can I just make one other quick point before we get to the first
Please.
question? You'll remember there was a lot of talk in February of last year, 2024, that a warning by the US that the Russians were getting ready to launch a space nuclear weapon. And the thinking was that with one explosion, they could take out all of these network communications networks, right? And the US then went around to the Chinese, the Indians, and others, had them raise it and said, hey, Mr. Putin, if you do that, I know you'll feel great about taking out the US networks, but you're also going to take out Chinese networks and Indian networks and your own networks. And we have not seen him launch the space nuke.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
the moment may come,
Thank.
and if you ever wanted the example of an asymmetric use of a nuclear weapon, boy, there it is.
Yeah. We. So I was you know, inside the Biden administration. As this issue developed, and I was pleased to see countries like China not voting with the United States on our UN Security Council resolution and First Committee resolution, but at least abstaining in the face of pressure. And I think this is a clear indication that there are times where China will split from Russia on security matters. And I think it's a conversation that needs to continue. I was at the Nobel Laureate Assembly for the Prevention of Nuclear War last week at the University of Chicago. And those Nobel laureates and nuclear experts put out a declaration of ways to reduce nuclear risks. And one of the components was strengthening the Outer Space Treaty, which very clearly prohibits the placement of any weapon of mass destruction in space, but in particular nuclear weapons. And very much encourage states to continue to have a deeper conversation, not basically retread ground that is well worn and a source of conflict, but rather see the sort of space as a global commons and the security of space is in all of our interest.
Interesting question. When the Russians attacked the Vianet European network on the ground in the United States, I'm sorry, in Europe, hitting those modems, violation of the space treaty or not?
I think there's some lawyers who may start digging in on that. So yeah, I'll take it to the question. David Johansen asked, you were talking about the network-centric features of so much of our military infrastructure, and he was talking about tactical combat doctrine, Aegis combat systems in the Navy. Are those networks safe? Have they already been compromised? Would they be available in a hot war? Is that something that we should be investing more time and effort into defending against?
Certainly, there is a need to go defend against these, but I argue in the piece that appears in the bulletin that you have to think one part defense, one part resilience. And that's the wonder of why do we like these satellite systems that deploy thousands of satellites? Because if you take out a few satellites, you can reconfigure them, right? And keep your network running. And then one part deterrence. And it's the deterrence piece of this in cyber we still have not figured out in any way. You know, why have we been unable to deter the Chinese from repeated attacks on our systems, right? Because they haven't really paid much of a price, even though we could go off and strike them. Is it possible to deter cyber using only cyber means? Or do you have to escalate your deterrence to make the other country think it could spill into a kinetic war rather quickly? So we've got a lot of work to do there. I think we have made some good work on defense, and AI is going to speed that up because it's going to find vulnerabilities faster. Last week, for the first time, Google announced an AI product that had found a very common vulnerability and gotten it patched and sealed up in systems used around the world that, a human being might have found, but it might have also taken 100 million years, right? But AI is also going to speed up the offense side of this as well. Makes the resilience and deterrence pieces all the more important.
So in building resilience, you need public support for the kind of investments you would need to make. What other role is there for the public to play in providing, a check or, sort of a better, management of these potential dangers? And this is from Thomas Huckins. And
Really,
he said, how do you
really,
get the public to focus on it when they are focused on so many other issues like climate change?
really good question. So first of all, getting the funding for this kind of thing, particularly at the state level, is really difficult. And let me give you the most concrete example that we've all been fixated on since the 2016 election, and which we heard President Trump talking about again today as he accused former President Obama of treason and sedition back to the 2016 election, convoluting the facts along the way. The US tried to convince a lot of states and localities to put all kinds of very expensive cyber protections on their voting machine infrastructure. Okay, so in the United States, one of the things that makes our voting system so protected is that every state, and even within states, we use a mishmash of all different kinds of systems. The whole network that we use of voting systems makes absolutely no sense, and that's probably our greatest protection. You go to Germany or France, they use a common system by and large across the country, which makes it a lot easier to attack. The US's greatest protection lies in the fact that if you figure out how to attack the voting system in Chicago, it tells you nothing about how to attack it in New York or a little town in Vermont, right? Um, and the second thing that we've learned from these voting systems is that it's very hard to get governments to invest in this because you are asking them to invest in voting machines that they use one day a year at most. And the money's probably coming out of filling potholes and plowing roads that they have to do every single day. So that's one of the reasons that when you hear the federal government say, oh, this isn't a role for CISA, the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, the answer is it is, because you're not going to get individual counties and states and cities to invest in this. Cyber resilience has got to be something that we all invest in. And that's at home, but it's also for cities, states, and the federal government. Let me give you another analogy here. We expect, Alex, that when you leave home to go to the bulletin in the morning, you're locking your door and you're putting your alarm system on, right? And maybe you've got some cameras around as additional deterrence because you're going to pay for protecting yourself against common street crime. We're not really expecting that you are going to be working out a system to protect your house against incoming missile attack from the North Koreans or the Russians or the Chinese or any other nation state. We're not even expecting your police force to do it. We are expecting the federal government to do it. President Trump's got no problem with that if he's building the Golden Dome over the entire country. But for some reason, we seem to think that individual cities and states or small businesses are going to protect themselves against state actors like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, to name just a few of the major cyber actors, or that hospitals are going to be able to spend the money to ward off very sophisticated ransomware operations, which we've seen cripple hospitals across the country. And the inability of our political system to figure this analogy out, to say, sure, it's a federal government responsibility to create the Golden Dome against missile attack, but not to protect against Salt Typhoon,
Mhm.
completely befuddles me.
You know, is one of the issues, speaking of Golden Dome, uh, that there's a sort of a overall dearth of expertise, on some of the, sort of the underlying theories behind a lot of these, defense structures, the interrelationship between offense and defense, the idea of sort of, the diffusion of assets. Is Are members of Congress equipped to have these types of conversations, or are they just writing blank checks because they just don't have the wherewithal to sort of question what's presented to them?
I'm sure there's a big element of that. And if you do a separate one of these um, conversation sometime on Golden Dome, please invite me back because I've got a lot to learn on it. But I've also been putting a little bit of reporting time into it. And, you know, needless to say, the president was impressed with Iron Dome in Israel and thus wants Golden Dome for the United States when the problems are completely separate. Iron Dome is protecting against slow moving below the atmosphere level rockets. And of course, Golden Dome is supposed to protect against ICBMs speeding through space at many times, or against hypersonics that are not following a normal path. Um, so, do people in Congress understand that? A number do, but not everybody. Do people in Congress understand very much about cyber? Well, more than they did 10 years ago. But somehow it was acceptable in Congress to hold a hearing 10 years ago and say, oh, I don't understand any of this cyber stuff. I asked my 10-year-old granddaughter. Can you imagine if you had said in 1958, oh, I don't understand much of this nuclear stuff. I'm asking my grandkids about, Stalin's increasing nuclear force? It
Yeah.
probably would have been politically costly. It's not in the cyber arena.
Hmm. I think there's a heavy reliance sometimes, because members have to cover so many issues. They have experts on staff, and the
Yes.
same is true of, has been true of the federal government. Namsa Ndagwe is asking about. She was asking about specifically the field of nuclear policy and the cuts that have been made in that space. But overall, is this push to reduce the size of the federal workforce being, sort of asymmetrically put onto these, functional experts who simply can't be replaced? It's hard to grow a cyber expert or a nuclear expert. That's years of investment in that particular field of expertise. How do we do
Yeah.
this without the experts?
So I worry about this across the government. CISA obviously has gone through some remarkable cuts, but wildly so in the arena of elections, right? Because President Trump believes that the declaration by CISA in 2020 by Chris Krebs, who was running CISA at the time, that the election was fairly run, was a huge setback for him, and he has now demanded that the Justice Department investigate Chris Krebs for we don't know what.
Hmm.
Um, the In the State Department, we have seen that the new Bureau of Digital Diplomacy that President Biden created and that Secretary of State Blinken created is being cut up and its functions are being spread around the State Department. I don't fully understand yet how that is, but the idea of consolidating it in one place was to begin to get people to focus on the diplomatic solutions here, much as in the 1960s, we began to create divisions of the State Department to think about nuclear arms control. And the firing at NSA of the leader of Cyber Command in NSA was followed by months in which no successor has been appointed. There's rumor of one now, but would it have been acceptable to leave no one nominated to be in command of Strategic Command, which runs our nuclear weapons, for as long as we have left the NSA and Cyber Command without permanent leadership? I don't think so.
No, I like the linkage of understanding the seriousness of these security challenges and putting them into the frame that we have with previous sort of revolutions in technology, like we did with nuclear weapons. Of course, we seem to be going in the direction uh, opposite of the progress we've made. But in sort of sum up here, if you had the ability to sit in a room with President Trump or Xi or Putin or any of these leaders who are considering investments and using cyber warfare, in offensive and defensive strategies, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I'm not sure they'd be looking for my advice. So, first of all, is don't walk backwards, right? So, as of next February, unless a miracle is pulled off, we're going to be without the last bilateral treaty we've had on nuclear weapons. And since we were thinking of modeling our cyber diplomacy and cyber treaties somewhat on the lessons learned from nuclear, the fact that we're going backwards in nuclear is not a good sign. Second is I would encourage all sides to focus deeply on resilience, as we have said, and all sides to focus on detection and to make as much of that attribution public as we can. And something I do have to give credit to the Trump administration for is that in its first term, it did something that the Obama administration did not, which was it began to call out countries that were responsible for significant cyber breaches. And now public attribution is a little more the norm. And I think that was a good sign. Um, the third thing is I would try to begin to expand that discussion that the US had with Xi Jinping that resulted in the declaration that you would not use cyber or you would not attack cyber systems that were involved in nuclear command and control, and then say, what other kinds of systems are off limits? If you were to develop a Geneva Convention for cyber, what would you do? And I think the answer is you would focus on civilians, right? You would say hospitals are off limits. You would say electric grids are off limits because the electricity goes off and a patient is reliant on medical equipment that's using electricity. You can obviously see the immediate civilian casualties. You might say that commercial air systems are off limits. You might declare that the Federal Reserve and other banking systems are off limits and say to the Israelis, sorry, we understand why you attacked an Iranian bank, but that's a violation of the system. So I think that you could begin to take some things off the table. Now, will you have a difficulty proving violations? Absolutely. And that's where having superb attribution technology steps in.
That's a good place to stop, and I feel like you've just written a whole article there about how we manage these problems going forward.
Readers who want more of that can read the end of The Perfect Weapon, where I dealt with some of this at some length.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, David, for the interview in the magazine. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it for your time here today. To hear more from David, you can obviously find him in the New York Times, read his books, and subscribe to our magazine to hear from him and other experts in our newest edition on global flashpoints. And thanks to all of you for being here today. As a nonprofit media organization, the Bulletin raises over 80% of our revenue from donors and subscribers. So if you enjoyed this conversation today and you'd like to see more, please consider a donation. There are links in the chat. And please join us for our next live event on August 21st. The title of it is Science, Power, and Consequence, Luis Alvarez and the Atomic Age, a lesser-known atomic scientist, a Manhattan Project scientist, but an incredibly important one, and looking forward to that conversation. Hope to see you all there. And David, we will certainly be coming back on Golden Dome and lots of other subjects.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Great to be with you.